Hi, hello and welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. My name is Omar Wasso. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, and I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to speak today with technologist and media scholar Ethan Zuckerman. We're going to talk about his new book, Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. For those not familiar with the Brennan Center, it's a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University's School of Law. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan 501c3 and does not participate in elections or endorse or oppose candidates. We are grateful to many people, but in particular producing partners for this event, NYU's John Brademas Center, which advocates for civil debate in politics and public policy. Also, we'll be taking questions later, so please feel free to add your questions to the question and answer box, and we'll come to that at the end of the discussion. So now, without further ado, I'm excited to begin this discussion with Ethan. So Ethan, one of the most striking figures to me in the book is some survey data you show in the beginning from the American National Election Survey that shows Americans are losing trust in institutions across sort of almost every area of life, from government to media and beyond. I wonder, if we don't trust each other as citizens, we don't trust our most basic institutions to be responsive. How does society hold together? How do you make sense of mistrust as something that is potentially pulling us apart?
Omar, that's the big question, and thank you for bringing it out so early on in the conversation. Let me start by saying I just couldn't hope to have a better interlocutor than you on this, because you and I are both very interested in understanding efficacy during the civil rights movement, right? You've written just a brilliant paper looking at the effects of protests during the civil rights era. And in many ways, that's a jumping off point for me in this book. I'm really interested in why my students at MIT and now at UMass are often so skeptical of the ways that we're taught to make social change. We're often taught you should either go into the voting booth or you should go out into the streets. And coming out of the Occupy movement, I found a lot of students who were skeptical about either way of making social change. And you and I think, both grew up in the generation where we were told that the civil rights movement was the way to make change. And I got very interested in what's changed between then and now. And that survey data that you referred to is one of the more dramatic changes I can think about. In 1964, really the height of the civil rights movement, if you went out and polled Americans, 77% of them would tell you that they trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time. This is not universal. If you asked Black Americans, if you asked Latino Americans, the numbers would be lower. But across the board, it's a pretty high level of trust. That number changes, and it changes fast. It plummets during the 1970s. And by 1980, the end of the Carter presidency, you're down to 24% of people saying that they have a great deal of faith or some faith in the government. We have been at or below that Carter line for the last 15 or 16 years. So right now, if you ask that question of Americans, do you have some or a lot of faith in the US government, you're going to get about 17% of people saying yes. If it were only the federal government, that would be an interesting phenomenon, but it's not. What we see through the 80s and the 90s is a collapse of faith in a wide range of institutions, everything from big business to news, to the police, to the church, to universities. And what seems to have happened is that the people who are your and my students have grown up in a generation where all of these institutions who we were taught it was critical to influence, it was critical to work with these institutions to make social change. We are now working with students and young people who often have very low levels of faith in any of those institutions. The question then becomes, what do we do? And I think the answers to it have a lot to do with ideas that you and I both take seriously, this idea of shaping what's the agenda, this idea of making changes around social norms, and using just a wider and broader toolkit than perhaps we were taught to use in making social change.
So I'm right there with you, but I want to get to the more optimistic part a little later.
Yeah,
so let me start with the pessimism.
Go for it.
and so one of the other things you emphasize in the book, which I is I think right, but I kind of want to at least kind of get you to tease out a little.
Push on it, absolutely.
Is that one of the big stories in the world today is democratic erosion. Right,
Yeah.
that we see, whether it's Hungary or the Philippines, just in lots of different countries, including the U.S., signs of kind of populist strongman politics carrying the day. Right, and so you, in your introduction, say this is not just an American phenomenon; this is a global phenomenon, and that mistrust is at the center of that. Right, so yes, your students and my students might kind of be more skeptical, but there's something broader going on. And I wonder, one, why do you put mistrust kind of at the core of that? And what do you think is driving it?
Yeah, so there's a paper that was pretty revolutionary in both your and my fields, controversial, but very much worth talking about. Stefan Foa, Yascha Mounk, Democratic Deconsolidation. This was a statistics paper that looked at the World Values Survey, something that's pretty common in our field to use as a statistical data set. It looked at this very specific question: do you think that it is essential to live in a democracy? And if you ask people who were born in the 1930s, the 1940s, they'll say, of course, it's necessary to live in a democracy. If you ask people born in the 1980s, they'll say, no, it isn't. And in some cases, you'll see this change from 75 or 80%, almost near certainty, down to sort of 20 or 30%. So there's some overall dissatisfaction going on with the system. The larger social bargain between people and the institutions that they're governed by. I think that I spend a whole chapter trying to figure out what this is. And my conclusion at the end of the day is it's really two things. One is rising inequality, right? So we see the story of rising inequality at the same time as we see the beginning of this deconsolidation, at the same time as we see this rise in mistrust. We see inequality rebound in the 1970s as we get into the sort of neoliberal bargain of Reagan and Thatcher. The other that seems to fit well in terms of time series is just individual institutional failure. People have pretty good confidence in the financial markets until 2007. People have pretty good confidence in the church until the Catholic Church sex scandal. And these breaches of trust become very hard to recover. Why does this help us with strongmen? It turns out that trust is a different thing between individuals and between institutions. You can have a society with a very high degree of interpersonal trust. You trust that, your neighbor will return your wallet to you if it's found. You trust that the average person is probably a good person. You can have that and still have very high mistrust in institutions. Strong men figure out the way around this. Donald Trump shows up and says, don't trust the government, don't trust the deep state. It's not the institutions that will save you. They're all corrupt. I personally have the way through this. And we're seeing that in Poland, we're seeing it in Hungary, that's Bolsonaro's playbook in Brazil, and it seems to be working. And my argument would be the reason it's working is that we now have, if not a generation, possibly generations of people who feel so alienated by the system. And let's be clear, not just on the right? It's very easy to see this as a right-wing phenomenon. It's easy to look at April 6th and say mistrust, January 6th and say that mistrust is what leads you to storm the Capitol. But the Occupy movement is a mistrustful movement, right? That's a left insurrectionist movement essentially coming in and saying global capitalism and this version of democracy is not working for the majority of people. And that was a worldwide movement for more than a year. That to me suggests that these symptoms are getting perhaps too dangerous to ignore.
One other idea, early in the book, in chapter 1, you echoing this point you just made, say that the left-right divide might be less useful for understanding contemporary politics, and rather that to quote you, the most important tension is between insurrectionists and institutionalists. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, these are unfortunate terms at this point, right? You don't get to choose when in the world your book comes out, but I stole these terms from Chris Hayes, and he wrote a very good book, I think underappreciated, called Twilight of the Elites, where he sort of ends up suggesting that you actually need a two-dimensional grid to understand most contemporary politics. Left-right can be helpful, but institutionalist insurrectionist is more helpful. And the way that he used the terms, and the way that I've stolen them, are that institutionalists believe that change happens by good people joining institutions, working to make them stronger, helping them achieve their ends. Insurrectionists look at this and say, have you seen these institutions lately? They're just not working that well. We might need to radically reform them. We might need to tear them down and start from scratch. So here's where it gets tricky, right? The term insurrection, I think now for all of us, calls up men in horned helmets, storming the Capitol. What I actually meant by it is probably better explained by the defund the police movement, right? So when we look at the movement for Black Lives, we look at a group who, through systemic mistreatment over generations, have incredibly low confidence in the institution of the police, and who are saying, look, incremental reform isn't going to do this. We've seen incremental reform for 40 years. We actually need to look at this specific institution and simply take it apart and build something else in its place. People, of course, like to make the argument that this is an argument for anarchy. No one's suggesting that. What they are suggesting is that this function of public safety and of justice could be achieved through something other than the incremental reform of a deeply broken institution. So the question comes, if you've hit this level of very high mistrust in these institutions, can we take seriously that insurrectionist argument that some of these institutions actually need to be dismantled and something new built in the place? And that's the essence of the argument.
And to kind of continue on that thread, right, there's like a long tradition in American politics of that kind of without the system fight for change, right? So whether you're talking about the Boston Tea Party or the American Revolution, or as you open the book with Shays Rebellion, right, like there's like in some ways a very proud American tradition of a militant opposition to repressive systems, to to institutions that threaten our liberty, right? And so in some ways, one, I guess I wonder, how new should we think of the insurrectionist tradition, and how do we adjudicate between different kinds of extra legal or without this, outside of the system kinds of movements? Is there a way to sort of say this one? The people who are storming the Capitol, they think of themselves as freedom fighters too, right? So maybe we should embrace insurrectionist in this broad sense.
So we have a deep history of insurrection within our country. As you said, I started out with Shays Rebellion, which is an armed rebellion in Western Massachusetts. Part of why I'm knowledgeable about it, because it literally takes place where I live. But it's this rebellion in which farmers who'd fought in the Revolutionary War find themselves unable to hold onto their farms. They're being taxed. They have no military pension. They feel wholly unrepresented, and they try to take over the armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. And it's significant mostly because it freaks the crap out of our founding fathers, who look at this and say, we actually need a standing army. We can't just use hired mercenaries. And besides that, we actually need a constitution. We can't just do this with the Articles of Confederation. We need a much more strong federal state. But you also have Thomas Jefferson looking at this and saying, yeah, let's not go too hard on these guys. And in fact, they don't, right? What's amazing about it is that for the thousands of people involved with Shays Rebellion, only 6 of them are executed. They're all executed for looting. Daniel Shays actually goes on to receive a military pension from the US government. So historically, we're very good at sort of recognizing the need for insurrection. What's tricky is that institutions calcify. As soon as you have an institution, as soon as you have something that goes beyond the image and personality of its founders and into a system of rules, a system of traditions, a system of processes, those institutions inevitably work to protect themselves. In the business world, they're sometimes overturned through catastrophic market shifts, right? So, we had the institutions of long distance phone companies. Suddenly, being able to do, international phone calls doesn't look like a great business anymore when we can do it over Zoom or do it over Skype, and they can disappear all at once. The trick is that businesses don't have armies. It's much, much harder to have that sort of revolutionary change within the political sphere. Government bureaucracies have a real tendency to sort of preserve themselves. So one of these questions is, how would we get positive revolution? Can we get to this point where we can look at systems that are clearly not working well for us and say, no, here's a moment for actual revolutionary change. Let's think about how to do this differently. I would argue that generally speaking, that sort of revolutionary impulse in political thought has generally been sort of a far left or far right. It's been outside of the realm of reasonable debate. I actually think in some cases it probably needs to become within the realm of reasonable debate. I actually think our precursors for this in many ways come out of, again, Black Power movements. I actually see the Black Panthers as one of the best examples of this, of sort of looking at institutions that they, on many levels, would say, these simply cannot serve us. We are not getting education. We are not getting healthcare. We need to build an alternative healthcare or alternative school system. I think we may be reaching a moment where that spirit of institutional failure is now spreading beyond a group that has experienced systemic suffering for many, many generations, but now becoming sort of a mainstream political position. That's a very difficult position for a state to find itself in. And I think that may be the position we find ourselves in as a state.
A great example. The Black Panthers are sort of most famously known for, images of holding guns. But of course, as you note, right, that like the school lunch program or school breakfast program they developed,
the medical program, yeah,
put pressure on the state to actually start doing it itself. And so right. Those are good examples of, in some ways, the outsiders putting pressure on the insiders to be more responsive. And so let's fast forward.
Yeah.
And one of those groups that we think of as being disruptive, as being a kind of a force for good, at least as we were coming up in the internet, was things like online community, was social media, right? And so in the kind of, to quote the famous Facebook phrase, right, we're going to move fast and break things, right? That has an insurrectionist, a kind of positive insurrectionist quality. And yet, of course, here we are in this moment where Facebook feels quite fraught as a force in our lives. And I wonder, do you think of, so you mentioned inequality as a core factor, unresponsive institutions as a core factor in this kind of rise of mistrust. To what degree do you think social media is a key engine of mistrust?
Yeah, so one of the motivations for writing the book was these conversations that come up again and again, which sort of begin with everything was fine until Facebook came around. And I just found myself sort of going, that can't be true, can it? And so one of the interesting things about looking at this and finding that, yeah, absolutely, there's a huge trust shift after Bill Clinton, right? So as we start getting into the modern digital age, that does correlate to lower trust in institutions. But of course, we plumb those depths earlier, and we sort of plumb them earlier under Ford, under Carter, under parts of the Reagan presidency. So it's really hard in some ways to sort of say that the internet is causal around that particular factor. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is that there's lots of possible information factors that you could bring into this equation. Is it possible that our ability to self-research and often in many cases find the information that supports our own arguments at the expense of the larger context, is that a destabilizing factor? Sure, probably. Is widespread publishing a destabilizing factor? No reason why it wouldn't be. there's great historical antecedents on this. Before the English Civil War in the mid 1600s, we see this loosening of control over the presses in London. And we see, the year before England is plunged into civil war, we actually see something like 40 times more publications than are sort of published before, most of which we would now call fake news or disinformation. So there's informational factors we can sort of look at in all of this. I don't think it's causal. I think you can trace a lot of US partisanship much further back to the rise of cable news and to the sort of loss of a single authoritative voice, the ability to sort of isolate yourself on left and right. But I do think that these legitimate questions, is Facebook helping us or hurting us? Is YouTube leading us down rabbit holes? For me, it's sort of what the punchline of the book is. I don't know to what extent you find this with your own writing. I try very hard to take my own advice. And what my book sort of ends up arguing is find an institution that you think is critically important and that you feel like you could fix and work to fix it. And so my work post mistrust is actually looking at social media and saying, can we build social media that's actually good for us as agents in society? Because I don't think there's much evidence that Facebook is doing a particularly good job. My output there is not that social media is suddenly the most important thing to work on. It's that it's a place where I personally have a certain amount of traction and a space for change. What I'm hoping to sort of call people to do is look at institutions that they have lost faith in, whether it's the police, whether it's the church, and say, can I try to find a way to participate in that sort of radical transformation? One of the things that seems to work at this particular mistrustful moment is that people have more trust in institutions that they are a part of. If you want to help someone understand how hard it is to commit a fraudulent election in the United States, you should invite them to become poll workers, right? As soon as they end up participating in that process, what they end up finding out in many cases is that, oh my God, it would be really hard to rig an election. And they often get to the point where they find themselves sort of getting kind of chippy about this. Wait a second, I worked really hard to make sure that no one was rigging an election. How dare you say my election was rigged? In many cases, what we actually have to do with these institutions is open them up so that people feel like they're part of them rather than, sort of being oppressed by them, essentially.
So I love that example, and I wonder if there are others. I mean, you have stories from around the globe, and I wonder if there's one that stands out around this kind of transformation of going from being maybe more of an outsider, an insider, or a skeptic to a believer, or an insurrectionist to an institutionalist.
Here's my favorite on this. And let me just say for any academics on this, please hire this young scholar immediately. His name is Luigi Reggi. He just graduated from SUNY Albany with his PhD, but he started his career as an open data advocate within the Italian government. And so he would build these award-winning websites to provide transparency about EU cohesion funds, right? So these are funds that are given by the European Union to make everyone feel good about being part of the European Union. And no one would use his websites. And so what Luigi found was everyone assumed that this money was corrupt, it was being stolen all over the place. So he organized something called a monathon. And a monathon is a civic monitoring hackathon. He would invite groups of people to go out to one of these cohesion projects and read the books, visit the building, find out what was sort of going on there. It turns out that the vast majority of people who do this come away going, oh, actually, they're spending our money really well. They did a really nice job there. So everybody goes into it expecting to find fraud and corruption. Occasionally they do. But the vast majority of the time, what they actually find is here is a system that is working surprisingly well and is doing this with a surprising amount of transparency. The project has worked so well that it is now part of high school education in Italy. It's your senior civics project is to actually go out and do one of these monitoring exercises. So, this in turn, of course, will become its own institution. Then we'll lose trust in that. Then we'll need some sort of revolutionary change on that. But at least what's great about this is sort of taking and harnessing that idea of monitoring and transparency and opening it up beyond, just narrow groups like civil society organizations, academics who sort of do that auditing work, making it an actual part of citizenry. I think to the extent that institutions can sort of get out of that sort of oppositional stance of saying, trust us, everything's great, and instead sort of say, come on in, please help us figure out what we're not doing well. I actually think that's a lovely place to be on these things.
I feel like one other kind of theme in that story that's important to underline is that kind of it echoes a point you made earlier, is that part of what some evidence shows in the challenge of the rise of cable television and in some ways social media is not even so much that we go into our silos, but that we watch entertainment, we disengage from civil society, we're not talking to our neighbors, we're not going out and participating in the kind of action on the street that is kind of the ebb and flow of civic engagement. And so I wonder how you think about, what are the things that get people to turn off, Real Housewives and go become an election monitor, or like how do we get people to feel like there's this opportunity to participate in a way that feels meaningful?
So I think in a word, efficacy. People have to feel like what they do can have an impact on society. And usually what I'm encouraging people is not to become election monitors, right? Like, I worry that what's happened is there's a standard model of civics. The standard model is register to vote, support political candidates, write letters to them, occasionally take to the streets. And I understand entirely why many people find themselves alienated from that. I think particularly if you look at politics at the federal level, it's very, very easy to get alienated through. You and I also both know there's real conversations in political science about why would anyone bother to vote, right? The marginal value of your vote is so unlikely to swing an election. It's such, in many ways, a thin form of political participation. So for me, what it really comes down to is where do people feel like they can actually make a change? I look at sort of contemporary social movements like Me Too, for instance, where it turns out that personal storytelling is an incredibly powerful way to make change. Me Too has not led to a legal shift, it's led to a normative shift. You have people talking about experiences of abuse that they might not have talked about previously. And that comes from people standing up, voicing what's happened to them in a way that is incredibly powerful and compelling for the people closest to them, and really seems to change the rules within environments. You and I both work within academic environments. I know that my academic environment has been utterly transformed by Me Too and sort of what's coming out of it, despite the fact that there are no laws passed in the wake of it. So my question in all of this is, how can you get people off the sidelines? And I think the answer is, how does an individual feel like she or he could make the most change? And I think getting beyond criticizing people and sort of saying that's not the right way to make change. I have very little patience for the people who are sort of trying to police. It's not activism unless you're actually sitting down at a lunch counter and potentially being beaten with hoses. No, it's activism if it has a chance of making a change. If you have a well-constructed theory of change, you don't necessarily have to risk your life to do this. And thank goodness, right? We shouldn't have to change our societies through, the level of risk that Alexei Navalny is taking in Russia. We should be able to participate using what tools we have at hand. And we, in the political science and social change space, need to get much better at recognizing those forms of participation and taking them seriously.
So if I hear you correctly, and I should say we're going to go to questions from the audience in a moment, but if I hear you correctly, so mistrust poses this, in some ways really profound threat to our societies and our governing order, but efficacy and efficacy through engagement is in some ways not to say the antidote, but is a powerful kind of a way to counteract mistrust. Is that
I'm trying to
fair?
be an optimist without being a Pollyanna. This book is absolutely a bright, flashing red warning sign, essentially saying that we may be feeling reassured that Joe Biden is in the White House and that things are not quite as crazy as they were 6 months ago. But look, we have been right up at the edge, and we have really been seeing a moment where people are starting to have very, very little faith in institutions and pulling away from them. The good news is we're already seeing so many different ways. People are trying to figure out how to make change, even when those levers of change that they're taught to use feel broken or stuck. And so, if we can start taking that seriously, if we can cultivate those things, if we can celebrate those things, that could be a really transformational moment for civic participation.
I am persuaded, but we've got still some
Bring
hard
us the questions,
questions.
my friend. Go for it.
So one person asks, okay, so maybe there's this broad trend of mistrust rising, but are there things that are specific about the United States that we should be paying particular attention to?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The United States, up until 3 or 4 years ago, was sort of a medium trust nation. So we really have sort of two data sets that are helpful on this. We have the World Values Survey, which looks across a large set of nations, but asks a wide variety of trust questions, but isn't really specifically trust focused. There's also a commercial survey done by the PR firm Edelman, which is done specifically around trust in institutions, trust in government. Edelman's is annual, and generally the US has been sort of in the middle of the pack. There are a lot of nations, including Japan, Russia, most of Southern Europe, that are lower trust than the United States. The US has recently fallen. And what I would say is the Trump administration really weaponized mistrust. Usually, if you are aligned with the political party out of power, you are mistrustful of the government. If you are aligned with the political party in power, you are highly trusting of the government. Trump changed that. Actually, people on both sides of the political aisle were highly mistrustful of the government because Donald Trump said, "Don't trust the government." And it's deeply, deeply, deeply unusual. So, what I'm starting to see is dynamics that we've really only seen before in countries like Russia, where there's actually an organized effort by the government to get people to trust nothing. And this is an idea that's really explored by Peter Pomerantsev, Masha Gessen, some of these really terrific scholars of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. But we're seeing some of those dynamics within the United States. So is it unique to the US? I think it might be unique to the US over the past 4 or 5 years. I think, unfortunately, what it is actually an emulation of some of these systems that we've seen really take hold in Russia, Hungary, and Poland.
You quote Pippa Norris
Yes.
roughly saying, trust is something that's hard to gain and easy to lose. And so I wonder, given that, right? Like, is there? I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your optimism. Like, where, what gives you that optimism that we can regain trust, given how much has been lost over the last few decades?
I wrote a decent chunk of this book while visiting Taiwan. And Taiwan is probably the country that I'm most optimistic in the world about today. And I'm optimistic about it in part because it's just showing incredible resilience in the face of these forces. Taiwan's government is very, very new. The party that's in power came into power in 2014. There was a revolution. There was a student-led revolution, an occupation of the parliament. So a real full-fledged kick the bastards out, start from scratch. Those new governments tend either to be very unstable or tend to be pretty dictatorial. Neither is the case in Taiwan, right? It's been an incredibly open government. It's made real efforts to seek inclusion, particularly digital inclusion. And there's incredible success stories coming out of Taiwan about how this has helped even in cases of COVID-19, where when you started seeing people flock to stores to get masks, an individual did a crowdsourcing project to try to help people figure out where to get masks. And the government called him up a day later and said, can we take this off your hands for you? This is really great. We'll give you all the credit, but we just want to scale it up. Now, what Taiwan is doing that's so amazing is that Chinese mis and disinformation is sort of being trained on Taiwan with a ferocity that we've just not seen anywhere else on the planet. And there's just incredible responsiveness to it. So this is a country that's gone from having basically zero faith in its institutions to really quite robust faith in its institutions through the gospel of participation. And it doesn't mean that everyone participates, but having that door open seems to make an amazing difference. That notion of, here are the ways that I could participate, and there's a very good chance that I'll get listened to, seems to be enormously important and encouraging. So that's one of the states that I'm looking towards the most closely, for sort of a recipe for how to regain trust, a la Norris.
Another question from the audience, on this sort of comparative note, says, are there experiments in, quote, deepening democracy or participatory institutions from abroad that you think could be beneficial to try here? Parenthetically, the person notes, New York City has dabbled with participatory budgeting from Brazil, for example.
Yeah. Participatory budgeting is a fun space to consider and study. In theory, what it does is it takes a chunk of the budget and takes it out of ordinary budgeting processes and puts it in the hands of ordinary people. The truth is, it is usually done as sort of a rounding error in overall budgets. And so the danger is that it looks more like tokenized participation rather than sort of fuller participation. There's an enormous interest right now in local as a way of sort of getting away from our federal level problems, right? I'm fond of telling people that, the city that I live outside of doesn't bother having partisan mayor races because is there really a Republican or Democrat way of filling potholes? The truth is, we just mostly have Democrats up here. It doesn't make any sense to run the Republicans there. We're not necessarily as enlightened as we think. I think we're now starting to have some real questions about whether these hyperlocal experiments are the good news that we think they are. A lot of people who are sort of looking at systemic racial injustice are finding that two of the areas where there is disproportionate impact are policing and schooling, both of which are the most subject to local control within the United States, right? And essentially what this is doing is allowing local districts in some cases to make some really terrible decisions. So I think absolutely. Are there lessons to be learned through participatory systems? Oh yeah, absolutely. Should we be doing more of it? Yep. But we also need to understand that this can be a form of tokenized participation if we're not careful. And what we actually need to do is look at some of those very large structures and ask the question, is it going to be incremental fixes to this, or do we actually need to tear things down and build them up rather differently?
On that note, one question from Gene Golden. I think it's easy for us to celebrate kind of rebels in a certain way, right? And the people who kind of challenge the system. And Gene Golden asked, I agree that institutions can become calcified and useless. However, they can also help to create important pillars for our society, right?
Yeah.
And as you noted, places where the institutions get torn down can often become very, difficult places to live, right? With dropping standards of living and enormous levels of violence. So how do we? Gene asks, what do you think of the idea of better accountability and flexibility in the creation and sustenance of institutions?
Yeah. So one of the things that I ended up talking about in the book, I mean, she's absolutely right. Like it's way too easy to make insurrectionism sexy and to sort of complain about people who choose to work within institutions. I got really interested in this idea of people who come into an institution and decide to really take it back to its roots, take it back to its core purpose. One of my favorite stories around this is the progressive DAs movement. So we're seeing a movement throughout the United States of people coming into the district attorney's office, taking on that role of the public prosecutor and trying to use it as a space for racial justice. At the end of the day, the DA's job is not to put people in prison. The DA's job is to achieve safety and justice, right? And safety and justice might not mean incarcerating lots of Black and brown people. It might mean using a much broader toolkit of restitution, community work, diversion, drug treatment programming. And so you see someone like Larry Krasner, who ran and won the DA seat in Philadelphia based around this, who sort of came in with some really radical and sweeping changes, functionally decriminalize marijuana, functionally decriminalize prostitution on his first day in the job. On his second day in the job, published a list of 100 cops who would no longer be called on to testify by the Philadelphia DA because they were known to be biased within these cases. That is a radical thing to do within an institution. If there were a single institution that I could encourage progressives to try to figure out how to become radical institutionalists, it would be the prison system. I would love to see a wave of progressive prison wardens, with the idea being that maybe we could actually get back to rehabilitation and focus on reentry rather than focusing on punishment. These people exist. It simply hasn't become a movement yet. So love and respect to the institutionalists, maybe what I'm actually trying to do is complain about the incrementalists, the people who are looking at institutions and trying to pull them back to their roots are some of the most important and interesting people out there today. The worry is people who fool themselves that that's how they're going to have change, but don't understand just what a radical step that can be within institutions to try to make change that way.
I love that idea. We're getting close to the end of the 45-minute session. And so I wanted to kind of end on a note that's a little more personal. One of the things I've always admired about your participation is the degree to which it's sort of deeply embodied. In other words, like I feel like you have a set of values you articulate, but you really kind of live them day to day in ways that I've admired from afar for many years. And I wonder, how do you think about how do you think of there's so much excitement.
People are calling in to complain, Omar. You're on the take now. They think that that I paid you for that.
Yeah. So, you know, there have been moments in your life where you have been confronted with, challenges about do you stay within a system? Do you exit? Do you participate as an insurgent, or do you participate as an institutionalist? And I just wonder, for people who are listening, how you think about those kinds of challenges in your own life and how you have been able to sort of, again, to my mind, sort of embody a certain set of values that are for change, but also operating within institutions.
So I think that may have been a very kind and polite version of the what happened with leaving MIT question.
No, it's more than that. It's more than that.
So I'm going to say, I think I'm going to duck that particular one.
Yeah. No.
Look, the probably the most rewarding project of my entire life has been helping to build the Global Voices community. And this was a community that sort of started from Rebecca McKinnon and myself looking at media, saying, look, we're both very involved with critiquing media, critiquing foreign coverage. Let's figure out a way how to change it. And by creating something that now is 15 years old, has trained whole generations of journalists from the Global South, has given really key insights on the ground through things like the Arab Spring, it's now its own institution. And of course, when Rebecca and I look at it, we feel sort of like proud grandparents. We try very hard not to steer it because it's kind of got its own space and power and way of doing things. it's also probably overdue for a revolution. There's probably at some point soon that people are going to say, this really can't be run from, you know, the US academic community, which is where its roots are. It probably needs some sort of revolutionary change to go through it. I really think the most powerful thing people can do for social change is to try to build institutions. But I think the hope is to build institutions with the knowledge that they're going to have to go through revolutionary change, that your initial vision for them cannot be the vision for them all the way through, that a real institution over time has to figure out how to change and morph the people that it's serving and the people that it embodies. So to the extent that I've been able to do that, you know, once or twice, that I feel really good about. I think the other thing that I'm just finding in general is, and I'm sure you're finding this too in your role at Princeton, is this need to be the coach and not the player. I think people like you and I, who've both been involved with social change movements since we were very, very young, we get taught that it's about our effort, about putting ourselves on the line. I think there's not enough talk about how we coach and not enough talk about how we support people to take those risks, to figure out what it means for their careers, to figure out what it means for their families, for the people around them. And, you know, that's something that for me is now a leading edge, trying to figure out how I can be a better support for some of the phenomenal people in my orbit, like Joy Buolamwini, who's going out there and making enormous, impactful social change around things like artificial intelligence and racial justice. My role is not to stand up and share the spotlight with her. It's to try to figure out how I can help support and uplift and be a coach there. And I'm finding that work is much more rewarding, even than the making and founding work that I've done.
I think we may be a little over time. I'm just going to check and see. Okay, yes, yeah.
We have that finish when ready message from our friends at the Brennan Center. Can we just mention like how fantastic it is that the Brennan Center is making it possible to have this conversation. They've done such incredibly important work. They're on the leading edge of so many different issues. I'm really, really grateful to our hosts for making this possible. And Omar, I'm just so glad to have this chance to catch up with you a little bit and talk about these issues. We need to make sure that Brennan, you know, flips this around and lets me or lets someone else talk about the work that you've been doing, because it's just been so critically important in thinking around issues of race, thinking about issues of protest, thinking about issues of political change. So I'm just so grateful to have this time with you.
Likewise, really grateful. I have 100 more questions. It's so, this book, I want to encourage everyone to get the book. It's rich with ideas. It's really, you know, there's a saying that we are fact rich and theory poor. It also gives you really elegant ways to think about some of the problems, right? Insurrectionists versus institutionalists, different ways to think about efficacy, and again, a way to think about the moment we're in right now, one of, you know, sort of saturated with mistrust, but also one in which there are glimmers of light too. And I think that's really important in this moment, Ethan, when there's so much reason for to be skeptical or even to despair. So I just want to encourage people to go check out the book. And then echo your point, very grateful to Brennan, the Brennan Center for this. They're doing vital work on the front lines. And also thanks to the producing partner, NYU's John Bradamus Center. Again, I'm Omar Wasso, and just want to thank everyone for participating. There's also a newsletter you can sign up for at thebrennancenter.org. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.